What's it like to face the full force of the US military in battle? For those who have, it's a reality that haunts them. The raw terror, the sense of powerlessness, it's something soldiers will never forget. And when they share their experiences, you get a glimpse of the true impact of war, the kind that stays with you long after the battlefield is quiet. These are their stories. My grandfather was a young man, conscripted to fight for North Korea during the Korean War. He had no choice. He was thrust into the chaos of the Battle of Incheon, a battle that would change him forever. Through his eyes, we see the war not just as history, but as something deeply personal, an experience that's still felt by those who lived through it. Story 1. My grandfather often spoke about his time fighting against US soldiers during the Korean War, and the dread he felt, an overwhelming fear like staring at a tidal wave that would consume everything in its path. That fear wasn't just born of the sheer power of the enemy, it was the unknown, the rumors, the stories they were told. North Korean soldiers were convinced that US Marines were cannibals, that they were monsters in human form, and that the Marines were much taller and physically stronger than the average North Korean soldier. For a young man with little knowledge of what awaited him, that was enough to break his spirit before he even stepped onto the battlefield. But it wasn't just fear of the enemy. It was fear of being torn apart by forces you couldn't understand or fight. He recalled watching as Chinese and North Korean units were absolutely obliterated by American Marines. To my grandfather, it felt like they never stood a chance. His words, not mine, still echo in my mind. The emotional scars never healed. My uncle, who was also there, still doesn't talk about it. He's 86 now, but he never shared his experiences with his own children, not even when they were older. And as a kid, I remember something strange. When we'd visit for family holidays, he would mow the lawn without a shirt, and that's when I first saw it. The scars on his abdomen. I asked him about them, and he told me they were from an appendix operation. But as I grew older, I understood they weren't just scars from a routine surgery. They were scars of war, marks of survival that he'd never discuss. When I think about it now, it's hard to imagine how that kind of trauma shaped him. He was a pacifist, in every sense. Yet the horrors he experienced in Korea were too much for him to ever share. Even now, he never speaks of it. What was it about the experience that caused such deep scars? Perhaps it's something more than just the physical battle. It's the emotional toll, the lasting weight of surviving something you were never meant to survive. Here's the continuation, with further expansion to the next part. My dad, on the other hand, had a different war story, one that's etched into my memory even though he rarely spoke about it. He was in his 20s when he was stationed in Vietnam, and the things he saw there are still so vivid to him. There was one story he told me that still haunts me. He was walking through a field with his friends, and in a split second several of them were blown up by landmines. They were just going about their day completely unaware of what lay ahead, and then in an instant, everything changed. But there's one story that really stands out. It's the kind of story that sticks with you forever, even when you wish you could forget it. My dad and a group of his friends had been out drinking the night before they were set to enlist. They were sitting around a table, completely hammered, singing songs, and trying to block out the terrifying reality of what was about to happen. Then one of them did something that would change everything. Without warning, a grenade dropped to the floor, and in that moment, Evan ended. The blast took them all. I can still hear my dad's voice when he talks about it. It's a quiet kind of sadness that comes from surviving a moment like that, knowing that a split-second decision, an accidental mistake, could have had everything before it even started. And the worst part is that these young men were just trying to forget. They weren't ready to face the horrors of war, but war came for them anyway. And this is where the stories get even darker. A while back, I was part of a military simulation as an opposing force, OP4, during a special operations raid. We were all assigned roles, basic ones, but we were given the freedom to act as we saw fit within our designated roles. I had one job to be a squirter, meaning I was supposed to fire off a few rounds and run like hell. When the operation started, I remember the sound of the blacked-out Hummers approaching, the tension in the air. My job was simple: fire off my rounds and sprint to another building, hoping to catch the opposing team by surprise. But as I ran, I realized something terrifying. I was scared. I've never been the nervous type, but this was different. The sound of those Hummers closing in felt like a drumbeat in my chest, and as I bolted to cover, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to die. It wasn't real combat, but in that moment, I felt like it. When I think back on it, I remember feeling two things. First, it was strange that I was scared, knowing that the rounds we were using weren't real, just simulation ammo. But even with that knowledge, my body didn't stop reacting. The second feeling I had was the certainty of my death. There were too many of them. They had night vision, infrared sights, and I had only an AK-47. I was outgunned, outmatched, and I knew I wasn't going to make it. As I prepared for my death, the next thing that hit me was just how different real military operations are compared to what we see in movies. When the operators approached, I expected them to be silent, stealthy, like those scenes you always see in the movies. But it was nothing like that. They weren't sneaky, nor were they shouting orders like we see in action films. Instead, they spoke in calm, methodical voices, using first names as they relayed information. They were so efficient, so professional. There was no chaos, no panic, just controlled precision. It's a level of coordination that left me in awe. And then came the moment. I'll never forget. I turned the corner, unloading a magazine at their vehicle, hoping to at least make a dent. But as I looked up, I saw the most eerie sight imaginable. A red dot appeared, larger than anything I'd seen in training, racing across the sand toward me. I had just enough time to process it before I spotted another red dot, synchronized with the first, repeating the same movement, like they were working together. In that moment, I was both terrified and impressed. They moved with such precision, it was clear that I stood no chance. I ran from one side of the building to the other, trying to find any advantage I could, but it was futile. Two operators rounded the corners, hitting me in the chest and back with simulation rounds. At the exact same time, the sound of those rounds connecting was jarring. They cleared the building, their voices as calm and collected as ever. When they searched my dead body, they even began removing my mask. The plastic pressed into my eyebrow as they took it off, and I instinctively reached up to help them, trying to avoid getting hurt. In that moment, one of them almost shot me by accident. He politely asked me to let them know if I was going to make any sudden movements. It was a surreal experience. After the simulation, I met the operators, who had been part of the raid. There were about 20 of them, and they were some of the smartest people I've ever met. Many of them had gone to college before enlisting, spoke multiple languages, and none of them were the type of people I imagined. They were humble, professional, and incredibly grateful to us volunteers. It was clear that they didn't take their job lightly. They were just doing their part, and doing it exceptionally well. But all of this left me with a thought that I could not shake. I don't know how it would feel to face US soldiers in a real-life scenario, and after experiencing just a taste of their professionalism, I prayed I never would. It's not that the game wasn't real. It was the closest thing to real combat I could imagine. But what I saw that night, the skill, the precision, and the calm under pressure, it was enough to make me realize how wholly terrifying facing them in battle would be. It's about the mental strength, the focus, and the fearlessness that US soldiers carry with them. It's the way they operate in a world that's anything but calm, always prepared for what might come next. When they engage, it's not about chance. It's about absolute certainty. I remember hearing a story from my dad about the Marines during the Gulf War. He didn't go into much detail, but what he did say stuck with me. He told me how you would see a soldier's fear before you could see anything else. It wasn't about the soldiers yelling or showing any sign of panic. It was about how quickly you could tell that they knew they were facing a force beyond their control. The Marines weren't just men with guns. They were a force of nature, relentless and unstoppable. My dad said it was one of the most terrifying things he ever saw. And then there was the way he described their training. The US military doesn't just prepare soldiers for battle. They prepare them to face impossible odds. They create a mindset where losing is if not an option. To anyone facing them, it was more than just a fight for survival. It was the crushing realization that the US military wasn't there to just win. They were there to make sure the enemy had no chance at all. The fear of this mental conditioning isn't just something I've heard stories about. It's something I've experienced firsthand. When I spent that summer serving as an opposing force, OP4 in a US Army simulation, I saw just how deep that preparation goes. It's not just about being armed or being trained to fight. It's about being so far ahead of your enemies mentally and physically that you've already won before you even step onto the battlefield. I agreed with the comments from some people who said that the US military is massive, and sure, there are units that can look disorganized at times. But when you're talking about combat arms units, the infantry, the elite training centers, it's a whole different level. These units are prepared to handle anything. They've got the best equipment, the best training, and the best minds. It's not just about strength. It's about being smarter, faster, and more resourceful than your opponent. I'll never forget the story my great-grandfather shared with me about his time during World War II. He fought for Canada, and he remembered how it felt when the Germans would dive for cover whenever a Canadian plane flew overhead. But when an American plane came into view, everyone would scatter. It wasn't because they were just afraid of the plane. They were afraid of what came with the power, the sheer unpredictability of the Americans, was unlike anything they had ever seen. The same power, that same force, was felt by my great-uncle during the Battle of Normandy. He and his squad had been told that the Allies were being pushed back, and that any soldiers they encountered were likely just small units trying to slip through. But just days later, they woke up to find an entire regiment of US soldiers camped right in their midst. The shock, the disbelief, it was unlike anything they'd experienced before. They were overwhelmed and they surrendered. My mind often goes back to the stories I've heard from people who fought on the other side. My girlfriend's brothers were soldiers in the Iraqi army. They didn't last long. They defected as soon as they could, and they've often spoken about the overwhelming power of the US military. They talked about how insane the American arsenal was, how they were using armored personnel carriers that were impossible to damage, while they were on the ground with pickup trucks and bicycles. The difference wasn't just in the weapons they carried. It was in the training, the discipline. The Americans didn't give you any warning. You never saw them until it was too late. This fear of the US military wasn't just something I read about in history books. It's something that's been passed down in stories, something people from different parts of the world experienced firsthand. When the US military moves in, it's not just a battle, it's the beginning of indomitable force, and for those on the other side, it's a fight they know they can't win. And then there's the story from Panama. My cousins were kids when US tanks rolled up to my grandmother's house, firing over their heads. The terror they felt is something that still lingers with them. As civilians, they had no understanding of what was going on, just that their homes were being invaded by a force they could never fight back against. The fear that comes with being caught in the crossfire of a military invasion is something that doesn't easily fade. And there's something even deeper to all of this. The realization that fighting the US military is like fighting a force of nature. It's not just about the gear, the weapons, or the firepower. It's about the mentality, the training, and the unwavering belief that they are the force that cannot be defeated. It's the certainty that no matter what, the US military will not stop until it has completed its mission. And for anyone facing them, that certainty is both terrifying and humbling. When I think about all the stories I've heard, whether it's from my own family or from people who fought against the US military, it's clear that there's a common thread running through them. The unshakable fear that comes with facing an unstoppable force. It's not just about bullets flying or tanks rumbling. It's the psychological warfare, the feeling that no matter what you do, you're never in control. One story that stands out comes from a family friend who served in the Gulf War. He wasn't on the front lines, but he knew people who were, and one thing he always told me was about the psychological impact of facing American forces. They knew they were up against something bigger than them. It wasn't just the tanks or the planes. It was the Marines themselves. It's the fear that comes with knowing you're up against an enemy who will never stop, who is always adapting and always learning. They were trained to be unpredictable, to be relentless, and to strike before you even knew they were there. This is something my dad always emphasized. The Marines weren't just soldiers. They were a psychological weapon. He would tell me stories about how the soldiers on the other side would sometimes break down too the first shot was even fired. The mental preparation, the intimidation, it all played a role in how the battle unfolded. The reputation of the US military had a way of twisting the enemy's mind before they even engaged. I'll never forget how he described the Marines during the Battle of Grenada. The Marines were supposed to take only the top 10% of the island, while the army took but by the end the Marines had taken 90%, and the army had the rest. The opposition was practically fleeing from them. The Marines didn't just win, they dominated. The enemy didn't have a chance. Then there's my time as an opposing force. Even in a simulated environment, the fear was real. Sure, we were playing a game, but the intensity of the training, the level of professionalism on display, it was enough to make you feel like you were in real combat. I wasn't prepared for the level of coordination, the precision with which the operators moved. They didn't just know their roles. They had it down to an art. They were executing their plan with such calm that it almost felt like they were playing a game of chess. Meanwhile, I was the one running for cover, hoping to survive just a little longer. After the simulation ended, I met the men who had been part of the raid. What struck me most was how humble they were. These weren't the war-hungry soldiers you see in movies. They were smart, calm, and incredibly professional. Many of them had been to college before enlisting. They didn't see themselves as heroes. They were just doing their job, and they were good at it. But that's what made it all the more terrifying. They were so good at what they did that it felt like they could wipe you off the face of the earth in the blink of an eye. Thinking back on it now, I realized just how much I learned from that experience. It's not about the gear or the tactics. It's about the mindset. The US military trains its soldiers to approach every situation with complete confidence. That confidence built on years of intense training, experience, and discipline. is what gives them the upper hand in any engagement. And when you face them, it's not just a fight, it's a psychological battle. My great-grandfather fought in World War II. He told me a story that illustrates the same point. He fought for the Canadian forces, and one day, while he was on patrol, a German plane flew overhead. When Canadian planes came, the Germans would duck for cover, but when an American plane came, everyone dove for shelter. The Germans feared the Americans not just because of their power, but because they knew that the Americans didn't fight like anyone else. They were unpredictable, chaotic, and relentless. It was that unpredictability that made them terrifying to face. It wasn't just the technology that made the Americans so. It was the unpredictability of their tactics. My great-uncle, who fought during the Battle of Normandy, was a part of a squad that was told the Allies were being pushed back. They thought the war was over, but just days later, they woke up to find a regiment of US soldiers camped at their farmhouse. It was the ultimate shock. It was as if the Americans had come out of nowhere, and there was nothing they could do to stop them. The sheer force of their presence was enough to break any resistance. The stories I've heard from my friends in Iraq only reinforce this. Their brothers served in the Iraqi army, but they defected once the US forces entered the country. And when they talk about the Americans, there's no mistaking the respect and the fear in their voices. The US military's arsenal was something to be feared. While the Iraqis were driving pickup trucks, the Americans were rolling in with armored personnel carriers, capable of withstanding anything thrown at them. The difference wasn't just in firepower, it was in how the soldiers were trained to move, to remain undetected, to strike before the enemy even knew they were there. Then, there's the story of Panama. My cousins, who were just kids at the time, remember the fear they felt when US tanks rolled up to my grandmother's house. They had no idea what was happening. They were just terrified. To be caught in the middle of a war you don't understand, when you're just trying to survive, it's a kind of fear that doesn't go away. And for those who were on the other side facing the US military, that fear is constant. It's the fear of fighting against a force that you know you cannot defeat. In the end, these stories aren't just about war, they're about the terrifying power of the US military, and the psychological and physical toll it takes on those who face it. Whether it's soldiers in the heat of battle, or civilians caught in the crossfire, the impact of that force is felt across generations, across continents, and it's a force that's so powerful, so relentless, that no one who's ever faced it can forget the fear, the awe, and the respect it commands.